A knight there was, a very worthy man, that from the time that he first began to ride abroad, he loved chivalry, truth and honor, freedom and courtesy, as well on Christian as on heathen earth, and ever honored for his noble worth.
The first step in understanding colonialism is to separate the myth from the motive, and to recognize that the myth is so often so noble that to displace it seems slightly obscene. The conquering knight belongs to the world of chess, a game that is universal. It is the archetypal game of conquest and dominion, a metaphor of colonialism. The impulse of people to seek influence or dominion over lands far distant from their own is one of the great constants of history. The Romans, the French in Africa, the British in India, and so are its leading features. In the short run, the effort is a success, and in the long run, it is a failure. Invariably, the end is messy. The departure is usually sudden. The collapse is bloody both for those leaving and those remaining behind. The departure from the colonial world has been less the result of the rising power of the colonial peoples than of the diminishing interest of those who leave. All modern empires, Spanish, British, French, American, Portuguese, maybe even Dutch and Belgian, could have been kept if the people of the metropolitan country had thought it worthwhile to do so. But they were no longer as willing to expend blood and treasure to keep the colonial territories as they once had been to win them. Also, an important point, they were no longer willing to suspend disbelief as to their purpose in being there. The great prophets of 19th century capitalism, Smith, Ricardo, the rest, had surprisingly little to say about colonialism. They confined themselves to condemning the monopolization of colonial trade, exclusive privileges. Marx was more interested, and his views, repeated today, would cause surprise. Colonialism was a necessary and helpful step up from feudalism. The British in India were a progressive force. It was always agreed that the colonies did contribute to the prosperity of the capitalist world, yet the two countries with no colonies to speak of, Germany and the United States, enjoyed the greatest industrial growth of all. In fact, colonialism was taken for granted, and so was its myth. 900 years ago, when the game of chess passed into Western Europe, its pieces had a firm physical reality. Their counterpart in life was the Crusaders and the Crusades. The myth was of men of the highest religious purpose, committed to the redemption of Jerusalem from the infidel and to saving the Eastern Christians in Constantinople from the Turks. The unavowed motive was land and wealth. Preaching the First Crusade in Clermont in 1095, Pope Urban II was careful to say that good property would be available for the Christian taking in the Holy Land. This was a deeply inspiring thought to the younger, landless sons of the Frankish nobility, and so beneath the cross beat hearts responding to the age-old appeal of good real estate. The Holy Father, some scholars suggest, was also concerned with finding a job for the unemployed brigandage of Europe. Better to have them in Asia than in Europe. Arnold Toynbee flatly described the Crusades as belonging to the larger catalog of Western atrocities. The Crusades quickly achieved their most distant goal. Jerusalem was won, and so was the real estate that reinforced the commitment to the cross. Baldwin I, the first king of Jerusalem, was himself diverted by a fine property at Edessa, in what is now southern Turkey. Then the crusading, colonizing zeal began to fade. In less than a century, both Jerusalem and the lands were lost. There were more crusades, and often it was reported back to Rome that there was light at the end of this tunnel. But after another century, only a few footholds on the coast remained. Of these, Acre was the most important. Then on May 18th, 1291, Acre came under final assault. Things were as in Algeria or Saigon or Angola 700 years on. An Israeli scholar recently observed that the principal terror weapon of the time, Greek fire, is the chemical and military antecedent of napalm. The attackers at Acre promised a bloodbath for any surviving Christians, and such promises in those days had to be taken very seriously. As later in Saigon, to have planned for an evacuation would have been to concede defeat in advance. So instead, at the last moment, there came the wholly anarchic rush to escape. Space was sold to the highest bidder. Fortunes changed hands during the course of that single night. Passage out was by ship, not helicopter.
The long shadow of colonialism has been mentioned, and none is so long as that of the Crusades. It remained in the memory of Islam that men had come from afar with religious purpose and sanction to occupy Jerusalem and to take up the land. And it continued to be feared that one day they would come back. It was inevitable that any who did return would be viewed with the utmost hostility, and especially so if they claimed religious sanction. It didn't matter too much whether those returning were Christians or Jews. The shadow of the Crusades is still over Israel.
The people of the Levant had rallied to throw the Crusaders out. But in Europe, the crusading spirit, the colonizing spirit, had weakened. This was decisive, and this tendency to tire is a constant in the colonial idea. There was for long another constant. As enthusiasm waned as regards one region, it would wax as regards another. While the Crusaders had been going east, the Moors had been coming west and into Spain. In the same year that Spain freed herself from the Moors, whose architecture still enchants the visitor to southern Spain, she launched the greatest colonial effort after Rome. Its hub was here in Seville. Christopher Columbus was here in 1491 on a promotional trip, waiting for Isabella to finish with the Moors. With Spain, the colonial idea took on a definite administrative and intellectual form. To rescue souls was still the avowed reason. And for those committed to that task, it was real. Colonial motivation was never simple, one-dimensional. But as Adam Smith observed, the pious purposes of converting the inhabitants to Christianity also sanctified the injustice of the project. The pious purpose was the cover story, a concept not invented by the CIA. The deeper purpose of the project